cardiovascular system. And then in the next week, in the week after, we look at certain diseases that affect the cardiovascular system. So I'm going to go through the basic structure and function, and hopefully you'll be able to review all the concepts before we talk about the diseases. As you all know, cardiovascular system is composed of the heart and blood vessels. Heart basically is a pump, okay, that is constantly beating, and it causes the blood to flow within the vascular system, okay. Now I'm going to just show you this schematic diagram to make sense of what is the function of heart. How does it work as a pump, okay? And remember, and mind you, heart is actually two pumps in parallel. So we have the right side and the left side, okay, which are working parallel to each other. Now what happens as we studied when we talked about the respiratory system, we breathe in, the lungs, the oxygen is taken up by the blood, okay? Now, when the oxygen is taken up by the blood, this blood flows to the left atrium and then into the left ventricle. When left ventricle contracts, it pushes the blood through the aorta and other arteries, and the blood then flows through all the vascular channels. When the blood is flowing in the blood vessels, when it reaches the capillaries, this is where oxygen will be delivered to the tissues, okay, to the cells. The blood also takes, as you all know, nutrients from the gut, the food that we have eaten, and this blood will deliver oxygen and nutrients to the tissues. And from the tissues, it will pick up carbon dioxide and waste materials, okay? The waste materials will be excreted through the kidney. The carbon dioxide, which is in the blood, now this blood will come back to the heart, now into the right atrium, then into the right ventricle. And right ventricle will pump the blood, which will then go through the lungs, where carbon dioxide will be exhaled out. So this is a schematic of the circulation. We can divide the circulation into two major branches. So the circulation between the heart and lungs, we call it pulmonary circulation, which is the right side of the heart and lungs. The circulation between heart and all the other tissues in the body, cells in the body, we call it systemic circulation, okay? Now this is another picture, same concept in a different way. So if you think of heart as two pumps and you draw it on both sides of the lungs, so lungs are in the centers, okay? And you have the right heart, you have the left heart. It is the same thing. So when the blood goes to the lungs, okay, through the pulmonary artery from the right heart, sorry. Within the lungs, then you will have the arteries branching down to smaller arteries, arterioles, then the capillaries. And when they become capillaries, there will be exchange of gases around the alveoli, as we discussed previously, right? So this is pulmonary circulation. Same thing will happen when the blood flows through the systemic circulation. The major artery, which leaves the heart, that is aorta, will break down into smaller branches, then further smaller branches, then arterioles. Then it becomes very small, branches which are called capillaries. This is where the exchange will take place in the tissue. Okay, so you have these capillaries where gas exchange, nutrient, waste materials, all those things will take place. Right. So this is the basic arrangement of the cardiovascular system with respect to lungs and all the other tissues in the body. Does that make sense? So what we will do now, we will look at the heart first, then we look at the blood vessels later. Okay, so looking at the heart, let's look at the heart wall first, the structure of the wall of the heart. And as you know, heart is a pump, so it must have a lot of muscle in its wall, so it can contract strongly. Okay, if you look at the layers of the chest wall, if you just take like a slice of cake on a heart, all right, if you're looking from outside, the outermost covering is called pericardium. Peri means around, right? So pericardium, it has two layers, parietal and visceral. The visceral layer is attached with the heart itself. The parietal layer is the outer layer. Between the two layers, there is small amount of fluid, very small amount of fluid. Okay. When you move in further, you have a little bit of fat tissue over here, in which the blood vessels are traveling. The blood vessels which supply the heart muscle with oxygen. Okay. Although heart is pumping the blood, which has come from lungs filled with oxygen, heart cannot take oxygen directly from the blood. So it has its own blood vessels which supply the heart wall. Okay, these are called coronary vessels, and we will discuss about those as well later. Okay, when you come in from the pericardium, then you have this thick layer of muscle which is called myocardium, and this is a special type of muscle, right? There are three types of muscles, if you remember: skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Okay, and cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. So you have a thick layer of myocardium. Moving further in, you have the inner layer which is called endocardium, the innermost layer. Okay, so three layers: pericardium, myocardium, and endocardium. The blood vessels which supply oxygen to the heart muscle, okay, they penetrate in and they are traveling outside the myocardium. Then they send in branches or capillaries which will supply the myocardium. As you can imagine, the heart muscle would require a lot of oxygen because it never rests. If it rests, bye-bye, right? So it is always contracting, always requires oxygen. Now, if you look at the heart as a whole structure, there are chambers in the heart. Okay, the right side of the heart, we already discussed, is connected to the pulmonary circulation. The left side connected to the systemic circulation. All right. The chambers are named as atria and ventricles. So you have right atrium and right ventricle, left atrium and left ventricle. Within these chambers and also the outlets of the ventricle, we have valves which will only allow one-way blood flow. So blood cannot go in the opposite direction. It will only go in one direction. This is important because heart has to function as a pump. It has to pump blood in one direction, right? So you need these valves. So if you look at these valves, between the right atrium and right ventricle, we have what is known as tricuspid valve. Between the left atrium and left ventricle, we have mitral valve, also called bicuspid. It has two cusps, bicuspid or mitral valve. Now, in the right ventricle, the output channel is the pulmonary artery, and the valve here is called pulmonary valve. For left ventricle, the output channel is aorta, and a valve here is called aortic valve. Okay, and you have deoxygenated blood on the right side of the heart, and you have oxygenated blood on the left side of the heart. Easy and simple. Okay. Now, if you look at the valves more closely, now this is a view of the heart from above. You're looking at the heart from above. You have removed the atria, so you can see the valves. Okay, so this is the left or right side of the heart. This one, right side. Okay, on the right side, you have tricuspid valve. So it has three cusps: 1, 2, and 3. On the left side, you have bicuspid valve. Okay, and between the right ventricle and pulmonary artery, you have pulmonary valve, and between the left ventricle aorta, you have the aortic valve. Okay, they are also called semilunar valves. So pulmonary semilunar valve and aortic semilunar valve. Okay, in this particular picture, these two valves are closed and these two valves are at the moment open. So this is the phase where blood is flowing from the atria into the ventricles, but nothing is leaving the ventricles because these two valves are closed at this time. If you look at the other stage, okay, now the valves between the atria and ventricles are closed, but the valves which are connecting to the output channel, which is aorta and pulmonary artery, are open. All right. So this will happen in a sequential pattern. The ventricular valves will open. At that time, the pulmonary aortic valve will be closed, and then it will carry on as a sequence of events, and I will show you that later. Okay, is that clear? The basic structure of the heart, location of valves, chambers of the heart, right? Everyone okay? All right. Now the output channels or the input channels of the heart. So basically, the two major veins which bring blood back to the heart from the body are called vena cava or vena cavi in plural, superior and inferior. Once the blood is in the right ventricle, it is pumped out through the pulmonary arteries into the lungs. If you remember one thing from your basic anatomy and physiology knowledge, all right, arteries carry oxygenated blood, right, and veins carry deoxygenated blood. But here it is different. Pulmonary artery, although it is called an artery, but it is carrying deoxygenated blood. Okay, we call it artery because it is leaving the heart, although it is carrying deoxygenated blood. Okay, after blood goes to the lungs, gets oxygenated, it comes back to the heart through pulmonary veins. Now these veins will have oxygenated blood, remember that. That's why they are drawn in red color. After the blood reaches the left atrium, it will go to left ventricle. When left ventricle contracts, the blood will be pumped out through aorta. And it will be supplied to all cells in the body. Easy? Everyone okay? All right. Now, this sequence of events where the blood comes into the heart and leaves the heart, this is known as a cardiac cycle. A cardiac cycle. Okay? Why cycle? Because it's repeating again and again. When the heart relaxes, or let's say ventricles, we'll talk about ventricles. When ventricles relax, this is known as diastole. Okay? This is known as diastole. During this phase, what is happening? The valves between the atria and ventricles are open because the blood is coming to the atria and coming into the ventricles. This is the time when the heart is filling up with blood, relaxing and filling. The output channels are closed right now. So the aortic valve and the pulmonary valves are closed. You don't want the blood in aorta to come back to the heart, right? So those valves are closed right now. Ventricle is relaxing, blood is flowing in from the atria. Okay, this is called diastole. Once ventricles are filled with blood, now they will contract to pump the blood out. Where do you want the blood to go? Into the atria? No. So now the atrioventricular valves will close and the aortic valve will open and blood will go into the aorta. This change is called systole. Okay, so diastole and systole. These are happening one after the other. So this is a short video which shows you open closure of different valves and how the heart pumps blood. So this is aortic valve. Okay, this one is pulmonary valve, this one is tricuspid valve, and this one is mitral valve. Okay, these two are the atria and these two are the ventricles. So let's look at this video, see if that makes sense. Okay. So this is systole, ventricles contract, blood is flowing out into the aorta and the pulmonary artery, right? This is systole. When the ventricles relax, aortic valve and pulmonary valve will close, and now the atrioventricular valve will open, blood will start flowing into the ventricles. Make sense? Okay. Now remember, when these valves are opening and closing, there is a period, very small period of time when all valves are closed. Okay, so there is no net flow of blood. This happens, for example, the ventricles are filled with blood, all right, and they're going to contract now. They will contract to build the pressure to a level which is higher than pressure in the aorta before the aortic valve is open. So there is a period of time, very small period, when you have all valves closed. Okay. If you look at the cardiac cycle now in a schematic diagram, systole and diastole. So this is happening in the atria, and this is happening in the ventricles, right? Now tell me one thing, do you want the atria and ventricles to relax at the same time and contract at the same time? Or do you want this to happen in a sequential manner? What would you say? Do you want atria and ventricle contract and relax exactly at the same time? No? So what do you want? Sequential, right? Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Why? Because you want atria to contract and help the ventricles to fill completely before they contract, right? So it should be sequential. So let's go back. So atria will contract, which is atrial systole. Then you will have ventricular systole, atrial diastole, and then you have ventricular diastole. Now, when this is happening, okay, when the valves close, there will be a sudden turbulence because the blood will stop. This causes generation of sounds that we hear. When you put stethoscope on the heart, you hear these sounds, loop dub, loop dub, okay? The first heart sound and second heart. This is because of closure of valves. The first heart sound is generated when atrioventricular valves close. Okay? Second heart sound is generated when the aortic and pulmonary valves close. If we put it like this, so when would atrioventricular valve close? Just before systole, right? When the ventricle begins to contract, you don't want the blood to go back to atria. So you close the atrioventricular valves. This generates the first heart sound, which is over here, S1. Okay. Then at the end of systole, but before the beginning of diastole, the semilunar valves or the aortic and pulmonary valve will close. So you have the second heart sound. So you can correlate the heart sounds with the cardiac cycle. Make sense? Okay. If you look at the summary of cardiac cycle, it is a series of events which is happening both in atria and ventricles. Systole and diastole are the two stages. Atria contract slightly before the ventricles, allowing ventricles to fill with blood before they contract and push the blood into aorta or pulmonary artery, depending upon which side of the heart you're talking about. Okay? And valves only allow one-way flow of blood, and the sound is generated when the valves close. There is no sound when the valves open. Okay? It's only when the valves close, the sound is generated. Okay? Now imagine if someone is having a heart rate of 75 beats per minute. Just take this number. How many times do you think the heart is beating in 1 minute? If the heart rate is 75, how many times the heart is beating in 1 minute? Sorry, how long is the cardiac? My bad. How long is the cardiac cycle? If the heart is beating 5 times a minute, how long is the cardiac cycle? Yeah, 75 is 0.8 seconds. Perfect. Okay. So if you divide 60 by 75, so each cardiac cycle is taking how long? 0.8 seconds. 0.8 seconds. Make sense? So the whole cycle of systole and diastole is completing in 0.8 seconds. If we further break it down, okay, let's look at the duration of cardiac cycle. Now, if the heart rate is 75, the cardiac cycle is 0.8 seconds, right? Now, usually the diastole is longer than systole. So you need more time for the heart to fill than to pump out the blood. So usually, if the cycle is 0.8 seconds, all right. Now, if you start doing what they are doing, what will happen to your heart rate? Increase. Okay. For example, this is what happens. Your heart rate becomes 150. Okay. What will happen to the cardiac cycle? How long will be the cardiac cycle? Anyone? It will become shorter because the heart has to beat 150 times in a minute. So it will become 0.4 seconds for one cycle, one cardiac cycle. Make sense? Okay. When the cardiac cycle was 0.8 seconds, the duration of diastole was 0.5 seconds and systole was 0.3. Now the cardiac cycle become 0.4 seconds in total. What do you think will be the diastole and systole? So like this. So both of them will become half. No, that's not the answer. When heart rate increases, okay, the diastolic period is compromised. You cannot compromise on systole too much because you need blood to be pumped into the aorta. So systole will not shorten that much as diastole. All right. So let's give them a rest. Okay. So when the cardiac cycle shortens, both diastole and systole will shorten, but diastole will shorten more than systole. You can't compromise on making systole too short. Okay. So what is the problem that you expect if this happens? If someone is having very high heart rate, what do you think will happen? What is the problem you can think of? Anyone? Can't fail. So yeah, when diastole shortens too much, you will not have good filling of the heart. Okay. So when there is very high heart rate, you will not have proper filling of the heart. When you don't have proper filling of the heart, you will not have enough blood leaving the heart as well. So cardiac output will decrease. Perfect. So that's important to remember. Now, what controls the heart rate and the beating of the heart? This whole cardiac cycle thing. Okay. Do you always think your heart beats? No, right? So it is under autonomic control. But heart has gone one step further. It has its own control. It doesn't even rely on the autonomic nervous system. It has its own built-in pacemaker. So heart has its own pacemaker which generates these impulses which cause the heart to contract regularly. Okay. So this is as the conduction system, the one shown here in green color. So there is a group of cells here which is called sinoatrial node or sinus node. This is the pacemaker of the heart. So it generates an electrical impulse regularly which travels down these pathways and spreads along the whole heart, and the heart then contracts. Okay. So this is known as the conduction system. Sinoatrial node is the pacemaker. The signal then passes through this node, which is known as AV node, atrioventricular node, and then it flows down into the ventricles and spreads along the walls of the ventricles. Okay. One important thing to remember here is this electrical impulse which is generated by the SA node, okay, if it spreads through the heart very quickly, what will happen? The whole heart will contract together. But you don't want that. Remember, we said we want the atria to contract before the ventricles do. So what happens? This AV node has a built-in function that it delays the impulse. So there is a delay of impulse at the AV node. When you have impulse generated at SA node, both atria will contract, but the signal will delay here before it enters the ventricles. So there is a 0.1 second delay. 0.1 second delay at the AV node. So the atria will start contracting before the ventricles will do. Make sense? Okay. Now, okay, these basic concepts I think you have already covered when you did your basic anatomy and physiology. So I'm not going to go in detail of these. We all know that cells have membrane potential. They depolarize, the ions move in, move out, then there is repolarization. This is how action potential is generated. So basically, this is what this conduction system does. It generates action potentials which travel along the cell membrane of these cells, and then it spreads along the cardiac muscle. Okay. Cardiac muscle has two properties which make it distinct from all other muscles, which is the skeletal muscle and the smooth muscle. It has automaticity, it has rhythmicity. So it can automatically generate these membrane potentials, and it has a rhythmic pattern. Okay. The reason for that is there are some leaky sodium channels which constantly allow sodium to leak into the cells, which leads to generation of these rhythmic patterns. You don't have to go into details of those, just remember these properties of the cardiac muscle. It has automaticity and rhythmicity. Now, when these electrical impulses are being generated and spread along the heart, we can actually record these electrical impulses. And we do that by putting some electrodes on the body surface, which can pick up these electrical signals. And the recording that we see is called ECG, or electrocardiogram. You must have seen some ECGs, right? So this is basically a record of electrical activity of the heart. Okay? So this is what is happening. The SA node fires. There's a little delay at the AV node, and then the signal goes to the ventricles. So atria contracts slightly before the ventricles. When this is happening and this electrical impulse is traveling along the heart, as I told you, we can put electrodes on the body surface and we can pick up these electrical impulses. Okay. So there are different electrodes that we put, and you don't have to memorize these electrodes. I just want you to show you that there are leads that you put on the limbs, the left wrist, the right wrist, left foot, right foot, and there are some leads you put on the chest. So you can record different, activities, the electrical activity of the heart. Okay. A typical ECG recording. How many of you are familiar with an ECG recording? How many of you have seen ECGs? Yes. All right. Many of you have seen ECGs. How many of you have seen an ECG? Raise your hand. All of you. Okay. Perfect. So what is an ECG? Okay. So many of them say yes. All right. Perfect. So it is recorded. Previously, it was recorded on a piece of paper. Now you have electric recordings, right, on the computer. So what it looks like, so it looks like this, a typical ECG. There are, the form of ECG will change depending upon which lead on the body surface you are looking at. This is a typical one, okay, which is lead 2. So you have certain upward deflections, certain downward deflections. The first upward deflection is called a P wave. Then there is a complex of 3 waves. We call it QRS complex. And then there is another positive wave, which is called a T wave. Okay. Now remember one thing. Whenever you're talking about ECG, you're looking at the electrical activity of the heart. All right. It could be possible that you can record electrical activity of the heart, but the heart is not pumping. So the mechanical function of the heart is a separate thing. In ECG, you're looking at just the generation of electric waves and how they're spreading along the heart. Okay. So P wave, QRS complex, and T wave. What is P wave? P wave is generated when there is atrial depolarization, which means when both atria are depolarized. Okay, there is action potential traveling in the atria, then we see the P wave. Okay. QRS complex is ventricular depolarization. When all ventricles, they are having spread of the action potential. Okay. T wave is ventricular repolarization. Now, atrial repolarization, we can't see it because it is a short event and it is hidden within the ventricular depolarization, because ventricular muscle is so thick there is so much electrical signal generated there that we cannot pick up atrial repolarization. It is hidden somewhere at the same time when ventricles are depolarizing. So this is an ECG, a typical ECG recording. P wave tells you about atrial depolarization, QRS about ventricular depolarization, and T wave ventricular repolarization. When ventricular muscles are repolarizing, or going back to the resting membrane potential. Now, in addition to these waves, you can also appreciate there are some flat lines between the waves, and there is some time allocated for all of these flat lines. These are called intervals. So you have an interval between the P wave and the QRS. You have another interval between the QRS and the T wave. Okay, if I ask you the interval between the P wave and the QRS, this interval, what does this signify? Anyone? What does this interval signify between the P wave and the QRS? Yes? This is the delay, remember? Atria depolarize. There is a delay at the AV node, then ventriculars depolarize. So this interval between the P wave and the QRS is that delay. So how long that should be? I told you the time earlier. 0.1 second, right? So it should be 0.1 second. If this is longer, it means there is increased delay at the AV node, which could happen in some cases of heart block. Okay? So, all right. So these are called, so this is PR interval, which is from the beginning of the P wave to the beginning of the QRS, 0.12 to 0.2 seconds. Then you have QT interval, you have different segments. So when you are interpreting an ECG, you have to look at the intervals, the segments, the waves, and you can derive a lot of information about certain cardiac pathologies. Okay, but we're not going into those details at the moment. When we talk about some pathologies next week, we will see how ECG can provide us information about different